today, as I think you all know, we're going to be having a couple of conversations surrounding the broader topic of immigration reform in this country. For those of you who haven't met before, my name is Dan Schnur. I'm the director of the Unruh Institute of Politics here at USC. And we're very, very excited about co-sponsoring today's discussions with our friends at HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality, as well as the USC Political Student Assembly. Over the course of the day today, we're going to talk about the immigration issue from a couple different perspectives. This afternoon, we're going to talk about what can be done and what is being done at the local and community level to move toward immigration reform. But today, this morning, we're going to start with the debate and contest. And before we do, in just a minute or two, I'll introduce our panelists and we'll get the conversation going. But before we do that, I want to introduce a good friend of mine and our partner in today's conference. Hispanas is the president of the HOPE organization. We work together on a number of projects related to immigration and other community-based policy challenges over the years. She's one of the most respected political and community leaders in California. We're thrilled to have her and her organization here with us today. Helen, thanks so much for coming.
I want to thank Dan and the Jesse M Institute of Politics. I have to apologize. We're going to be talking about Washington, D.C. quite a bit. I just literally got back last night around 12 o'clock in the evenings or in the morning, however you can see it. But I did want to say just a couple of points. One is to describe a little bit about what HOPE is and what we do. HOPE stands for Hispanas Organized for Political Equality. We are a statewide organization. After my trip to Washington, D.C., there's a lot of interest of us becoming national, so that's always interesting to talk about. But what we do is we advocate and create leadership opportunities for Latinas across the state. And one of our key programs is the HOPE Leadership Institute that also looks at policy, but ensures that Latina leaders are at the table. And I'd like to say that after 15 years of 422 Latinas that have gone on through the Institute, we've had 40% of them either serving as an elected official or at a state or local commission. But the other thing is the discussion around policy and the importance of immigration. Interesting enough, immigration is not one of the key issues that HOPE concentrates on. But obviously, being our constituents being Latinas is the issue that we always discuss in so many variety of ways. And a lot of women in our community are very much involved as advocates. So there's two things that I want to put out there that I think is really important, is that we will be having a national conversation. You know, we'll hear from our panelists from a national viewpoint of what's going on in the scenes, but I think right now, what I'm more excited about is what's happening here in California. The work that a lot of Latina leaders have been doing to make sure that California is in the forefront and leading the states and creating a good opportunity to really model how we can work together with our immigrant community, since we are immigrants, all of us. So with that, I thank all of you for making it here this morning, and look forward to the conversation.
As I said a moment ago, later today, we're going to talk about what can be done, what is being done at the local and community level to make immigration reform happen. But we want to start out with a discussion about what is happening, or at least at the moment, more accurately, what is not happening in the United States Congress. And if you look at the program, you see that this panel discussion is titled, "The Debate in Washington, When Will Congress Act?" And I will admit to you on behalf of my team that title was developed a little bit earlier in the semester at a slightly more optimistic time in the debate. So what I would ask everyone to do in the audience is to either take out a pen or mentally change the headline to "When will Congress act, or will they act?" And we'll make that the premise for today's conversation. Let me take a minute and introduce our first group of panelists. We're really, really lucky to just have a tremendous group of individuals here with a great deal of depth and breadth on this issue. Sitting right next to me, some of you may recognize Linda Lopez. She's currently the director of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs for Los Angeles Mayor Garcetti. But until about 2 months ago, as many of you may remember, she was an associate dean for diversity and strategic initiatives for USC's Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. Sitting next to Linda is my old friend Jeff Gorell. And at least in terms of his USC exposure, this is his first time on the USC campus. We hope to bring him back for a couple of football games, but we'll start with today's conversation. Jeff is currently a member of the California State Assembly, representing District 44. He's the former Ventura County Deputy District Attorney and the former Director of Communications for the California Manufacturers and Technology Association. Rita Medina is a policy advocate for the Coalition of Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, but she's a former field representative and senior advisor to the Office of Congresswoman Judy Chu, and a former employee of HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality. And last but certainly not least is our friend Kevin DeLeo. Some of you may know Kevin and I team taught a class on campus last fall, in the fall of 2012, The Future of California. Over the course of 15 weeks, we fixed the future of California. So you're welcome. Kevin, as I think most of you know, is currently serves in the California State Senate, representing District 22 here in Los Angeles. He's a former teacher and a member of the California Teachers Association, and a former senior associate for the National Education Association. You've been watching this debate in Washington for quite a while now. You've been watching very closely. And even while you've been working toward immigration reform here in California, I know that you've been, I'll choose my words carefully, somewhat dismayed by the lack of progress that Congress has made on this issue. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind starting today's conversation by giving us a little bit of an overview of what you think the prospects for immigration reform in the House of Representatives are, when and if it may happen, and what the obstacles are to overcome.
So thank you, Dan, for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm honored to be here with your panelists here. And I want to say good morning to each and every one of you. I just got back from DC actually about a week ago. I was there for the weekend I'm a fellow at the Aspen Institute and work during the course of the weekend. And it was really uplifting because it's the fellows are comprised of a bipartisan group of individuals, both Democrats as well as Republicans. And I actually spent a lot of time over the course of the weekend with the former chair of the Republican National Committee, the first African American. That's Michael Steele of the RNC. So it was a good weekend, and being in Washington D.C. at the same time leaves you perhaps with a little dour feeling when you leave the town and come back home. This legislative session in California, we had a really productive legislative session, one of the most productive sessions in the last few decades. We got an increase in minimum wage. Will be the highest paying state in the union in a year or so. We got, for immigrants, we got a driver's license bill. That is huge because it's been 20 years in the works of trying to move forward a policy that makes sense with regards to public safety for all immigrants, so we can make sure that those individuals, regardless of who they are, where they come from, when they drive on our city streets, through our neighborhoods, when they drive on our highways, and in fact, they have been regulated, tested, they have a driver's license. We also have the Trust Act, which means that if you are detained by police for some infraction, you will not be held by ICE in the state of California because perhaps you were outside MacArthur Park selling tamales or elotes, corn on the cob. So that is a rebuke, if you will, of Washington, D.C. So California, and I'll say this, and I've said this very clearly, I think the California State Legislature is by far, bar none, the best legislative body in the country. And that includes the U.S. Senate, that includes the House of Representatives. Thank you. We got one applause. And the reason why is that we work in a very cooperative fashion, a very constructive fashion to get things done. We're concerned with delivering a product to improve the human condition for our constituents throughout the state of California. And I'll use one example, then I'll pivot specifically to your question. The debate on driver's license in the Senate was a very constructive debate. We had a handful of Republicans who supported the measure. More interestingly, we had a lot of Republicans who didn't vote for the driver's license bill, but they didn't vote no. And they just abstained altogether. In years past, we'd have one of the most polemic, polarizing, and quite frankly, irrational, illogical debates that anyone could ever witness in the political arena. when it pertains to driver's license bill, because when the word immigration pops up, people just lose logic, they lose, their own rationality, and it becomes so polemic, it becomes so polarizing. There's no debate that is based on merits, and we didn't have that debate when it came to driver's license. We had even a Republican who stood up and said, I'm for this. So when you contrast and you juxtapose with what's happening in Washington, D.C., when you juxtapose with what's happening, particularly in the Congress with Speaker John Boehner, it is very disappointing. And it is very underwhelming, the efforts of members of the House of Representatives to get this done. This is not a very complex issue. And I know one of the reporters, it was from CNN, had asked me when we got the driver's license bill passed, large ceremony out of City Hall. We had like 30 cameras. Never seen anything like it before. It was larger than the visit from the President of the United States, when maybe had 15 to 20 cameras. The driver's license bill, we had like 30 cameras, news media outlets there from throughout the country, throughout the world. Reporter had asked me, well, do you think because of what's happening with Syria in the Middle East, and what's happened with the government shutdown, that the Congress will be able to take this on full steam ahead? And the first thing that hit that occurred to me was that if you can't deal with an issue like Syria and the government shutdown and a whole variety of other complex arcane issues and deal with immigration simultaneously, then you really don't belong in the Congress. Because I know members of the Senate in California, members of the Assembly in California, the eighth largest economy in the entire world, deal with very complex arcane issues simultaneously together. In reality, if you have 535 members of Congress and you're dealing with the issue of Syria, the reality is perhaps maybe 20 members of Congress actually deal directly with the issue of Syria. The others maybe go to the house gym to work out, or go run around the mall and exercise. Not 535 members deal with the issue of Syria. That's a myth. Only members of the foreign relations committees, intelligence committees on either side of the house. So the inability for folks to deal with very complex issues, controversial issues, simultaneously is in my opinion, quite distressing. This is a very critical issue. We know that the Senate, through the Gang of Eight, quote unquote, a bipartisan group comprised of Robert Melendez from New Jersey, Schumer from New York, Rubio from Florida, McCain from Arizona, and a handful of other individuals have forged a package that, relatively speaking, is the best thing we got. To me, it's still not the best thing we could possibly have done, but that's what we got, and that's what's on the table right now. The fact that Boehner has not moved forward yet signals that he's under a lot of duress within his own Republican caucus from some extreme factions that right now control Washington, D.C. They have veto power almost over everything right now. So what I've seen, Dan, right now is underwhelming effort in Washington, D.C., a lack of courage to deal with this head on. This is not complex stuff. We're dealing with the national economy. We're dealing with issues of Social Security. In fact, if we're going to legalize these individuals with a pathway to citizenship, or are they going to be able to make Social Security whole that has an impact on all individuals, regardless of ethnicity, race, ideology, party, Democrat, Republican, socioeconomic status. So I'll reserve a little sort of my predictions of what may happen, but I just want to sort of kind of lay out is a great disappointment for something that really is not that complex to do.
Kevin, thank you very much, and we will come back for your predictions a little bit later, so stand warned. Before we go on with the conversation, just one quick note that I should have mentioned at the outset. For those of you who've attended our programs in the past, and I know that's many of you, I know that you know that one of our policies, one of our primary policies at the Unruh Institute for our programming is not to do any programming unless it includes students, not only as audience members, but as participants. And you're probably wondering where those students are, like for most of our discussions. And what I'll tell you is we will have student participation in this afternoon's panel and in our lunch discussion as well. However, Daniel Rothberg, the editor of the Daily Trojan, who is scheduled to be a co-moderator for this morning's panel, fell ill. So even our commitment to student participation can't stand up to germs. And for that, I apologize. Jeff, let me bring you into this conversation. Kevin gave us, I think, a good overview of the landscape in Washington, but I know you and a relatively small number of other Republican elected officials from here in California have made some efforts to push the Republicans in the House in the direction toward voting for comprehensive reform, either piecemeal or more broadly. A little bit later, I know you've got a remarkable personal journey on this issue to talk about. I want to come back to that a little bit later, but at least to get the conversation, keep the conversation going at this policy level, if you can follow up on Kevin's assessment and tell us whether you think sufficient support can be built for comprehensive reform in the House.
Sure, thank you, Dan. I represent the 44th Assembly District. It's a semi-coastal part of California, Ventura County area. Tens of thousands of undocumented residents in my district alone. Of course, we know that there's somewhere between 2.5, 3 million, maybe 3.5 million or more undocumented residents in the state of California. My position is that we have a remarkable opportunity to bring some renaissance to the state of California by acting on comprehensive immigration reform. Not only economic renaissance, but cultural renaissance, because it's frankly the right thing to do. So I've been very aggressive, along with a few other Republicans in the state legislature, in trying to move my party in the direction that understands that, because we believe that it's entirely consistent with Republican principles, founding principles and principles today, to embrace comprehensive immigration reform. The number of bills that come through the legislature, whether it's bills that I voted for to allow undocumented residents to have a driver's license in the state of California, or whether it's to hold other kind of licenses or to practice in the state bar. These bills are all symptomatic of the failure of Congress to act on this. And it's gone back many years. There was an initial push under the Bush administration to try to bring forth comprehensive immigration reform. And it's unfortunately probably now buried in some kind of trench warfare of partisan politics in Washington, D.C. I still have some optimism that they're going to address it before the elections next year, although it becomes increasingly difficult. I did have a chance to go back and lobby in Washington, D.C. Republicans. We met with probably 9 or 10 Republican members of the House and urged them to either adopt and to call a vote for the immigration reform package as it came out of the U.S. Senate, or to address those policies individually, but at least their entirety in terms of their component parts. And the feedback we got was pretty positive. Most of the members back there said, Jeff, we think we're going to take it up this year. There are a number of members of our conference, which Republicans call what we call our caucus, the conference back in D.C. that said there's a number of us that don't have trust in the Obama administration to deal with us fairly, to open the doors, to have a meaningful conversation, and to follow through on working with us on this issue. And there's some trust issues that I think have been exacerbated in the last few months with the shutdown, the federal shutdown, and the federal shutdown that happened in the federal government and part of that was at the very end, the Republicans said, okay, well, we'll come to the bargaining table, but we just ask you to put off the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare for 1 year, and the president rejected that. So now, moving forward a few months, you see now that Obamacare has had implementation problems, and it looks now to even Democrats to have been pretty wise to possibly postpone the implementation for a year to work out the kinks. And so the Republicans feel like they did some of those trust issues, I think, were exacerbated, and that now they're really hesitant to get into a negotiation with the White House on what he would sign and wouldn't sign. So that is going to create additional problems for us moving forward in terms of Republicans coming to the table. But I know that there are a number of Republicans like me, more of them than there are not, that say now's the time for immigration reform. It's the right thing to do. It's going to create economic renaissance. There are entities out there that are typical Republican stakeholders, like the like the agricultural community, the Manufacturers Association back there, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce are pushing very hard on this. We work very closely with them to try to move this. And until we have comprehensive immigration reform, the California legislature will still have to deal with this in this small and piecemeal way that we have, with driver's licenses, with resolutions, and press conferences. And it's too bad, because really now is the time to do this. I think it would like I mentioned in the beginning, would create a phenomenal economic and cultural renaissance for the state of California that could catapult our state back into the prominence that we once had among the states. And so, and of course, it's a big national issue too.
Jeff, thanks very much. Several important points, but one that I think is worth noting is that even though today's conference is specifically on the issue of immigration reform, not a conference about the world, it's worth remembering that no issue exists in a vacuum, and that a debate over Syria, over the MSA, over the Affordable Care Act inevitably is going to end up having some impact on the immigration reform debate, even as Kevin correctly pointed out, even if the members themselves aren't working on both issues, it affects the overall tone and the overall level of trust and potential for cooperation in Congress. So Rita, I'll come to you. You've worked in Congress, you've seen how it works, and even from a community standpoint now, I know you watch it very closely. What's it going to take? What does it take in order to get the two sides to work together on an issue like this one, from what you've seen and what you think?
So you gave me the hard question. Well, I think first of all, we have to recognize, as both of the gentlemen on either side of me has said, that there's a couple of things happening. There is this sort of a distrust and, in some senses, an unwillingness for the Republicans to work with not only Democrats in the House, but the president. And so you see that in efforts to not move forward things like the Senate bill S-744, or not to move forward H.R. 15, which was another comprehensive bill identical to 744 with a better border component. Still has security, still has E-Verify, all of the things that we see Republicans saying that they would like in a comprehensive bill. Well, then why hasn't that moved forward? So we're just looking at that space. How to get them to work together? I think it really just comes down to the pressure that the community is going to need to continue to put on both parties. You know, to be fair, while we are talking a lot about distrust, Republicans have to work with Democrats and vice versa, I think from the advocacy community as well, while we have great leaders in California as members of Congress, we also had hope and expect our Democrats to really push more than they have to move this issue forward. We have our own LA Congressman Javier Becerra, who's a wonderful leader on immigration reform, but even as advocates, we're pushing to say, we really, really need you to stop the partisan politics. And we really need you to listen to our communities. And it's just interesting because you have these sides fighting, and you have bills like the Farm Bill, for example, which should be so simple to pass. And that has run into a roadblock as well. And so that includes things like SNAP and subsidies for the farmers. And so that's a piece where you could see them come together. So what it really is just this political space where there's partisan politics. You have a lot with the elections coming up. But I think it's going to be, like I said, the communities to continue to push and to remind those folks, especially in purple districts where that's the mix of the red going to blue, that, you know, this has been an issue that voters have been waiting to vote on for a long time. They showed up for the presidential election with President Obama saying that he promised to get it done this term. And they've been showing up to elections ever since, and in greater numbers, because they expect this to be done for themselves, for their families. And as the senator said, it's a simple task. You have ideas already set forward. And so I think it's just really going to be a huge push, not only from California, but we're going to need to see it even more so, and especially in states that aren't built like California, where you have, just the populations are different, their ideologies are different, and it's going to take an even bigger national push to bring folks together and make the urgency around this even more real this year.
I think an excellent point, Rita, just as Jeff talked about how no issue exists in a vacuum, you're exactly right. Congress doesn't exist in a vacuum either, far from it. And pressure from other sectors can have a real impact on the debate and how it goes forward. So, Linda, let me bring you into this conversation because, of course, one of the most forceful voices for immigration reform in the country has been Los Angeles Mayor Garcetti. And he and a number of other mayors have gone to Washington and have advocated on a number of occasions on behalf of broader reform. Maybe you can offer us an overview based on that experience, what you and he see as a result of his advocacy efforts.
So I think one of the things I want to say is that regardless of what happens at the national level in terms of federal policy on comprehensive immigration reform, I think that LA really is the epicenter for immigration policy, for advocacy, for organizing, and we've really seen a lot of trends historically that come out of LA in terms of the May Day marches and other kinds of advocacy that work that actually influences a lot of different policies, both at the local level and at the state level. So one of the things that Mayor Garcetti is very interested in pursuing as part of his role as a new mayor here in Los Angeles, he's always been an advocate for immigrant integration, for immigrants in the city, and I think one of the things that is on the agenda is, number one, to coordinate with the President of the United States. He's been meeting with him at the White House recently, and also with other representatives in Congress, Republican representatives, to really advocate for immigrants. Most of us know, for instance, that LA, 40% of our population are foreign-born. Many of them are Mexican origin, but also we have a significant API community as well. So we don't want to forget those populations as we move forward with this agenda. And the fact of the matter is that about 459,000 Angelinos are undocumented. So it's a significant undocumented population in the city of LA. And so what Mayor Garcetti's also been doing, he created this new Office of Immigrant Affairs. It's both a policy, there's going to be a policy focus for our office, looking at national trends, but also really thinking about what's happening at the state level. And Senator De León is very right in recognizing that the California State Legislature has been a tremendous leader around different kinds of policies that really have a lot of impact on local level, right? So in terms of implementation, one of the things that we'll be doing locally through Mayor Garcetti's vision is to really think about the implementation aspects, for instance, of the driver's license bill. So the creation of a policy at the state level having direct impacts on local residents in LA. And so we do plan on having, for instance, a citywide plan around the driver's license implementation, because we know that we need to find those people locally, we need to engage those folks locally, we need to educate those folks locally about what documentation, for instance, might be required, how to work with other nonprofit partners, the consulates, and other kinds of actors within the LA immigrant rights community around how we're going to do that. So I think one aspect is a design of a specific policy that comes out of the state level, regardless of what's happening at the national level, that we can proactively be very strategic about and create opportunities for a citywide design or plan for that. The other issues that I think come up for us, and Mayor Garcetti also is very engaged in coordinating a group of 10 big city mayors around immigration reform and really advocating for comprehensive immigration reform. So he's had some discussions already and conversations with mayors from 10 of the largest cities here in California to also put pressure and also to see how in their respective communities, some of these are obviously Republican targets, that we could generate a more cohesive coalition building model around getting more mayors engaged in different parts of the state. And then finally, I think the other aspect to think about too is that regardless of what happens at the federal level, I mean, there's a discussion now about maybe more of a piecemeal approach to immigration reform and the path to citizenship. That what happens in LA, I think, is going to be really a marker for the rest of the country in terms of whatever happens at the federal level. So we are very proactive with our Office of Immigrant Affairs. Mayor Garcetti is very, very active around this issue and promoting and making sure that the right actors are together and coalition building with local elected officials as well. Senator De León has been a very close ally with Mayor Garcetti around these issues. He mentioned, of course, the driver's license bill and the signing, which really, I think, marked LA as a place where this is really going to be the epicenter for a lot of this policy. And what happens in LA in terms of the implementation of those policies really will create a buzz, I think, and also models that could be replicated in other parts of the country. So I think there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of advocacy that's happening. We have, for instance, a lot of nonprofit partners that we've been engaged with, CHIRLA as well, so I'm glad that you're here, Rita, because part of it is, on the advocacy side of things, it's very critical that we have the right partners together when we're doing this advocacy work behind the scenes, for instance, with different representatives of Congress, and really thinking through what that strategy and what those tactics look like, right? Because you're right, it's not just a Republican issue, but it's also a Democratic one. So looking at the partisanship aspect, I think, is very, very critical in mapping out what that agenda looks like moving forward. So I think there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of work that we're doing around, the focus of comprehensive immigration reform, but that, frankly, we can do a lot at the local level. And I think that part of it is, thinking about what we do in terms of capacity building around advocacy and policy-wise at the local level. And then I think we'll really see a lot of trends and a lot of ways that we can create models for other cities to follow.
Linda, you used a phrase just a moment ago that I think it's really worth coming back to. And that phrase was other parts of the country. When the immigration debate raged 20 years ago, when Jeff and Kevin and I were first getting involved in politics, it was an issue. To the extent that it got discussed in Washington, it got discussed because representatives from California and Florida and Texas talked about it, and for the most part, the rest of the country shrugged. John Dacey, the superintendent of Los Angeles Unified School District, has a terrific phrase, which I steal shamelessly. He says, "Los Angeles is America, only sooner." And so the question I have for you is, for you and for Mayor Garcetti, are there lessons that you can transfer to elected community leaders in other parts of the country who are newer to the challenges that this issue brings?
Mayor Garcetti had a vision to create an Office of Immigrant Affairs. We have a lot of other cities, major cities like New York, Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco, Houston. So we're kind of actually behind the curve when you think about, a robust local government, municipal kind of government institution that can really think about, the coordinated efforts around immigrant integration, immigration policy, and so on. So I think I'm going to preface my comments by saying that we're actually behind the curve when it comes to how local municipal government can deal with implementation of policy, both at the California level in this case. So I think we're very, very new to this space, if you will, but I think that it's obviously through Mayor Garcetti's vision that we see a very good opportunity in terms of thinking about LA and LA residents, right? Given that we are such a significant, we have a significant immigrant population, and also in terms of the undocumented, that it actually makes sense to create these government institutions that can then work with, the elected officials, that can work with our nonprofit partners, with labor, with business, with, faith-based communities. And so I think part of it is really building that infrastructure, and that's kind of where we are right now in phase one is, how do we get all these different actors and partners together And then number two, how do we collectively participate around certain policy initiatives that we feel are very important for our immigrant communities? And also in terms of just the implementation aspect, I mean, I think local governments have a responsibility, frankly, to its residents, regardless of their status. So one of the things that obviously is very important for us at the local level in LA and for Mayor Garcetti is how do we create opportunities for engagement around government? How do we provide opportunities for service delivery for our residents, regardless of their status? And so part of that is really thinking about a coordinated strategy around not only a service delivery model, but also thinking about, from a policy standpoint, how do these different policies affect our communities and what can be done at the local level to do something very, very profound and impactful, right? So it's not just a symbolic kind of thing that we're doing here. It's really about day-to-day people. It's about everyday people having the ability to drive, for instance, that are safe, that our streets are safe. So it's really a public safety argument. And I think couching it in those terms really provides a reframing of how these policies affect our residents. And then we have a lot of other issues that we're focused on too, right? Notary fraud is a big issue in the immigrant community, the unlicensed practice of law, and that's another policy area through AB 1159 that we're going to take on at the local level, because we know that immigrant communities are very, very vulnerable to these kinds of immigration fraud scams. So there's a lot of different policies, I think, that come down from the legislature that I think our local municipal government can have a very proactive role in terms of the implementation aspect.
Well, thank you, Linda. Hey, Kevin, I want to bring you back into this conversation. You said at the outset, you painted a very stark contrast between the ability of the California State Legislature to act on some of these issues and the challenges facing Congress. I wonder, just as Linda was talking about, how parts of the country that haven't been dealing with this issue as long as we have may learn from our example. What advice would you give to Congress on how to move forward the way you and your colleagues have been able to on this front?
Well, first I want to say that I agree with Linda in that Mayor Eric Garcetti has a vision for local government, obviously the second largest city in the country, and how we should incorporate and do everything within our power to ensure that these individuals who have been living and working in the shadows, become full, productive, members and citizens in the fabric of our society. And Linda is obviously chief point for him for this great cause here in the city of LA. And although we are behind New York, Chicago, and other places, the reality is this is the epicenter here. So what happens here, regardless if someone's gotten ahead of us, is going to be very impactful for the whole country.
Guys, on behalf of the Angelinos who remember Northridge, can you pick another metaphor other than epicenter?
Epicenter. We use that all the time. Jeff used I noted that Jeff, my friend and my colleague, used a key word here, and he used the word undocumented. And it's part of the vernacular with regards to the issue of immigration, and not to give Jeff kudos, he's a good guy, but just a few years ago that word would have never been uttered from the mouth of a Republican. It would have been illegal alien. It would have been just some of the most downward, disgusting, epithets that one can imagine. Even some members of Congress have made references to undocumented immigrants as to being subhuman or animals. A few members from Congress, a few members, I forget his name, out of Iowa. And that's key to what Jeff said, because there is an increasing number of individuals within the Republican caucus, the GOP, who understand the shifting ground underneath them, the changing demographics. Whether it's a question of values and principles within the GOP, or it's a question of facing political realities and understanding shifting demographics and understanding what the political realities will be very soon if you don't shift quickly. You know, that's part of the realities that we face as elected officials. But immigration is not, and let me underscore and emphasize and highlight and italicize and bold it, immigration is not a Latino issue. It's not a Mexican issue, and it's not a Central American issue, a Salvadoran issue, a Nicaraguense issue. Immigration is fundamentally an American issue. It is an American issue because this country was founded by immigrants from throughout the world. And it is a very big issue that cuts through the polity of American life. And I say this because usually before California, obviously the home to the largest number of immigrants, New York, you know, Chicago, Houston, San Antonio, and elsewhere, but in very homogeneous, you know, societies or homogeneous communities throughout the country, Iowa, Nebraska, South Carolina, you know, with meat slaughterhouses, the packing plants, you know, in Iowa. My brother-in-law, who lives in Tijuana, my former brother-in-law, Ricardo, went to work in Iowa at a pig slaughter farm. You know, it was the worst 2 years of his life. You know, it was cold. He didn't really like it out there, and it's hard work. But you have increasing number of immigrants in those areas that formerly were very homogeneous, you know, communities. So immigration touches our lives in every form, way, or shape. For those who, for example, live in, let's say, Paducah, Kentucky, you know, or Bloomington, Indiana, and if you use A1 steak sauce, that A1 steak sauce, those ingredients were touched by the hands of a Latina immigrant woman at a plant up in Ventura County when they mixed the A1 steak sauce. So regardless if you're Irish American, Lithuanian, Russian American, if you can tie your roots, you know, so many generations back to the Mayflower specifically, an immigrant touches your life in some form, way, or shape. You could be the most wealthiest individual, you know, who lives in Malibu or Pacific Palisades or Brentwood. And, you know, you obviously have the financial wherewithal that gives you the ability to make choices, you know, that other folks don't have choices. But there's a woman who's a domestic worker, who's cleaning your home, who's taking care of your children, while she leaves her children alone in a neighborhood adjacent to USC, you know, and her child doesn't have those opportunities, yet she's taking care of someone else's child clear across the city, and then has to get on the bus and just exhaustively come all the way back home to take care of her own family, and then go back again, you know. So it touches our lives, you know, and even the most isolated areas throughout the whole country. The GOP, as well as the Dems, you know, together have to get their act together. I will say this, and I understand the whole issue of colors, the issue with healthcare, the issue with Syria, the issue with China, the issue with the government shutdown. But I truly believe that, you know, trust is critical, but you cannot use leveraging points. You can't use other polarizing issues as a hostage, if you will, and say, because I don't like what you're doing with healthcare, because I ideologically, in the most fundamental way, disagree with the rollout of Obamacare or healthcare, I'm not going to engage with you in immigration. Or I'm going to leverage, because I'm not going to negotiate against my own, I'm not going to negotiate against myself. And I can do everything imaginably to extract as much as I can get from other issues that are not germane to the issue of immigration itself. So we have these political games that are being played out, because that's what they are. They're political games at the end of the day in Washington, D.C. I think that Democrats have to be a more robust, if you will. It's not enough to say I support immigration reform. It's like saying, hey, do you like the love puppies and, you know, and sunny days, and, you know, yeah, I do, absolutely. Okay. If you like sunny days and you've got to deal with climate change, whether you agree with climate change or you don't agree with climate change, what are you going to do to reduce your carbon footprint in a much more aggressive fashion? It's the same issue here. You have to be much more aggressive to deal with this situation. And I, you know, Boehner, you know, we saw what happened just a couple days ago, last week, when Boehner was having breakfast, you know, someplace, you know, off Capitol Hill, and we had 3 Latina girls, one of the members of CHIRLA, Rita saying, and who had the courage to go to one of the most powerful men in Washington, D.C., and you could see him physically and viscerally just so uncomfortable. He was very uncomfortable by these three, presumably teenage Latinas. And you could just see his face. He was nervous. He was very uncomfortable. This is, arguably the second or third most powerful man in Washington, D.C. Or whoever the leader of the Tea Party caucus is probably more powerful than this.
I want to give Jeff the chance to rebut where he cares to. Where he cares to in just a minute. But before I come to you, Jeff, I'd like to ask Rita a question, because Kevin raised, I think, a really interesting point. I know it's something that you've thought about. He said it's not just about Republicans, it's about Democrats being more assertive. And one of the things I know you've thought a lot about is whether President Obama has played as visible and as vocal a role on this as he could have. And he has on other issues, such as the Affordable Care Act. Is there an opportunity here that's been missed from earlier in the year or earlier in his term in office?
So since everybody mentioned that they were in DC, let's talk about, I was in DC last week, and there was a hearing in the House Judiciary Committee on entry-exit visa systems. And the hearing goes on, we talk about the fact that we know we need it, it's how much it's going to cost, and eventually it's going to be implemented. All just very factual. And so Representative Luis Gutierrez, who's been such a leader on this, when it was his turn to speak, he sort of addresses the crowd and says, we've done nothing here. We've done absolutely nothing. This issue is not moving forward one way or the other. And it was interesting to hear that, because that sort of signals that we know that Congress is stuck in this place. But I think one of the reasons that we haven't seen the movement, and of course we saw DACA come from the president, and that was a huge step forward for our communities. I mean, at CHIRLA, we see people every day who come in. We have a whole department that we dedicate to DACA applications and processing that has changed a life. Some of my best friends have had their lives changed because they have a work permit, they have a social security number, their driver's license, and that was a huge thing. But I think one of the things that we saw in that conversation in the House with Republicans and Democrats going back and forth is that there's sort of this stigma and this anti-golden touch that Obama seems to have in this current Congress. We had healthcare that was rolled out, and it has played out the way it has, and I think that it has given those Republicans and those naysayers of Obama the distraction that they needed to turn away from immigration reform and just completely focus on what's been going on with the ACA. And I really appreciate the senator talking about the fact that, without saying those words, you need to walk and chew gum at the same time. That issue can't be the only issue that we're going to devote ourselves to. What went wrong with ACA? There were plenty of other days to come back and do some work. So in terms of, has Obama done everything he can or used enough political capital? I think from the advocacy and at least our perspective and our work, there's still more that he could do. I mean, we've seen the highest number of deportations under the Obama administration, which is huge. And this is the base of the immigration reform issue, is that it's about our families and our communities being torn apart. Every day 1,100 people are deported. You aren't allowed to go into a deportation center or a jail with using your matricula, which is what a lot of people have, so they're separated from their families. And so that's what's at the base of this. But as soon as the president, other than just giving these statements, which I think Monday he's supposed to give another statement calling for another comprehensive push, as soon as the president gets involved, you hear then this distrust and we still want to do a piecemeal. So I think in a sense, and this is I guess just my personal perspective, because I don't know that CHIRLA we've taken a position on this, but just taking a look at it, I think that he's smart in doing what he can so far, but there has to be some distance kept, just because politically I think we saw Marco Rubio mention, and this was interesting, several weeks back, if we don't pass immigration reform on our own terms, the president is going to sign something administratively, and you're going to see this DACA plus. And you had a lot of chatter about that, and people got nervous, that's not what our president's supposed to be for. We're supposed to be relying on a Congress to work together and to pass a solution, whatever that solution looks like that's the best for our communities. And so, you know, he's trying to do his job, sort of shepherding folks along, but I think it's been very, very difficult just given the circumstances and the folks that are in Congress.
How polarizing this has become ideologically, because when Senate Bill 744 was crafted, they largely left the president out of this equation. And it was in so many words that they boxed in the president of the United States of America, arguably the most powerful man on planet Earth, a man who wants to get comprehensive immigration reform done. And the message was pretty clear. If you engage overtly on the issue as we negotiate, we will walk away from the table. So they boxed in the president of the United States. And the polarizing, again, ideological games are so pronounced in DC that the political maturity is mind-boggling, and that's why I'm so dismayed, because again, I give my friend Jeff, kudos. We dealt with climate change, fracking, minimum wage, driver's license, Trust Act, and a whole variety of very big issues that are much bigger than they're handling in Washington, D.C. And we dealt with them simultaneously. So we can chew gum and walk at the same time. I don't think they're capable of doing that in the Congress of the United States. That's why this mythology about how we watch CNN and C-SPAN and MSNBC and Fox and ABC, NBC, CBS, Syria. No, only 20 people deal with Syria in Washington, D.C., aside from the Brookings Institute, and other folks. Not 535 members of Congress deal with that. That's why we gotta just get their act together, man.
Jeff, quite a few points to cover here, but I'll lay one more on your lap. I've learned from experience that the word reapportionment is the single least interesting word in the English language. That said, given the way congressional districts are drawn in most states other than California, the creation of safe districts for both Republicans and Democrats has created the kind of polarization that you and the other panelists are talking about. And just like you have Democratic members who cannot or will not vote for stronger border enforcement or workplace enforcement, you have Republicans who aren't willing to move in the direction that you and some of your colleagues here in this state have been able to. Talk a little bit about the polarization on both sides, okay, if you can.
I'm sorry, Dan, I dozed off for a minute. Were you talking about reapportionment? I would like to just say briefly that I'm not probably the best representative of the kind of some of the extreme positions that come out from Washington, D.C. I'm not a very good partisan Republican. I joint author all of my bills with Democrats. I voted for a lot of these immigration bills we've talked about here that came through the legislature. I endorsed Eric Garcetti for mayor of Los Angeles. I'm not here necessarily with the best perspective to shed light on how the Tea Party and other folks approach these issues.
Foaming at the mouth.
But I do want to say that it's more than just an emotional response back there. It's more, the debate on immigration reform has kind of taken a sideline, because the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare has started to kind of fall apart. There's public relations issues that have been created for the president and the Democrats as a result. And is there some kind of neener going on? Perhaps, I don't know, but I do want to say this, that there is a legitimate concern about implementation. The last time that we as a nation really dove in and dealt with immigration was in the 80s. And there was an amnesty. That was thoughtfully done. But what a lot of people felt like is that the subsequent administrations did not implement the spirit of the law, which was to also create more meaningful border security. And so that it was a half baked policy implementation. Now the President of the United States is going to be responsible. Barack Obama will be responsible for implementing whatever passes Congress. There are the votes right now. There are the votes as we speak to pass comprehensive immigration reform in Congress and get it on the desk of the president. So if there are the votes there, why haven't they called for the vote? Why haven't they brought it up for a vote? Well, there's trust issues that are more than just political, that develop out of the concern for how the bill would be implemented. Barack Obama just recently unilaterally said that we're going to postpone some of the mandates of Obamacare upon insurers throughout the nation. And that is something that a lot of people, it may be debatable, but a lot of people believe is not in the law, allows him to do that. He is not a lawmaker. He is not a policymaker. He is an executor, executes the policies that are made by Congress. DACA is another example. Now I happen to agree and support both of those things that he's done, DACA and postponing Obamacare. I support both of them. There are a lot of people that say we don't trust the ability, we don't trust that this presidency and this administration will implement the spirit of comprehensive immigration reform as they believe that it would be passed and sent to him on his desk because of these issues. There's a track record for it in the past. So it's more than just neener. I think there is a concern that we've got a president who wants to be a lawmaker as well as the chief executive. And those are incompatible positions. That is unconstitutional for somebody to be both of those. So there's that. As far as reapportionment, I've seen, at least in the state of California, that we have the largest group of freshmen that just showed up this January in about 15, 20 years. And they were the first crop of legislators, both Republicans and Democrats, that came up to Sacramento based upon newly drawn districts. Districts that weren't drawn by state legislators, they were drawn by an independent commission. And these legislators also came up under new term limit laws. Unlike me, who can only be there for 6 years, these new legislators could be up there for 12 years. And I've seen a significant change in the culture and the atmosphere up in Sacramento, particularly among these freshmen that have shown up. They are not in a hurry to introduce legislation just for the sake of introducing legislation. And they're doing a lot more bipartisan effort. They're agreeing a lot more on some of these immigration issues, but they're agreeing a lot more on a lot of different issues. They know that when they go back, they have to, they have districts that weren't drawn politically to be as safe as that they've been drawn historically, and they have to report back and be responsive to the entire constituency. And so I see a much more pragmatic class of freshmen than I've ever seen since I've started working in the building in the early 90s. And I think it's healthy. I think it'll be healthy for public policy making, and I think it'll be healthy as an example for Congress to see as both Republicans and Democrats being able to work together. Now, I'll just conclude by saying the control of the California state legislature is not in doubt. The Democrats control the legislature, and they will next year, and 2 years, and 4 years from now, as well as most of the statewide constitutional elected. They all hold all of them now. They'll probably control most of them, if not all of them, for the next foreseeable future. So control of this institution is not in doubt. So people kind of put that aside and say, control's not the issue right now, so let's just work on public policy, thoughtful public policy. Now, control of Congress, the House, the Senate, the White House are always in doubt. So just as much of the power play is going on in Washington, D.C. over what policy is right, what policy is wrong, is the control of the House, because it's really everything. To control the House, you control the agenda, you control the purse strings, you control the entity that controls the budget. And unlike me, in the state legislature as a member of the minority party, I can introduce bills. I can introduce bills on my own, or I can introduce them with one Democrat or 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. But a member of the minority party in Washington, D.C. can't introduce legislation. They can offer up amendments that will never be heard. But they essentially are a government in waiting for the control to take back control of that particular House before they'll have any ability to really have an outcome on public policy. And so the fight over control is 1,000 times more important often than the moving the needle forward on important public policy. And that to a certain extent is that almost entirely is why you see so many of these games, and why you see that we're stuck in the mud on these important issues that we should be acting on this year.
In just a moment, I want to open this up so all of you who are attending have the chance to ask questions of our panelists. But Rita, I know you wanted to make a point real quickly before we went to questions.
Yeah, so of course, thank you. Really quickly, I want to thank the Assemblyman for pointing out that this last piece that you brought it home with. What we're seeing is a game of politics, but it's also the game of control. I mean, I worked for a member when we had the House, and it was great, and then you lost the House, and there's that frustration. And I remember having that frustration and speaking with the constituents and trying to talk about bills moving forward, because you're right, without control of the House, it's very, very difficult to introduce legislation. But I want to just come back to another point that I think, I respect where you're coming from this issue, but what I really think is that Republicans or opponents of immigration reform really cannot hold hostage people's lives because of a border and enforcement component. And the reason I say this is, look, you had the 86 piece, and we had implementation of that, whether it was border security and you still saw an influx of people coming into the country. A lot of that had to also do with the change in laws around 96, where you're having caps on visas for different countries. And why that matters is because you start to see these lines, and if you've heard about the lines, this is where they come from. You have people who are coming to this country because they want to be reunited with their families. Why can't they do it the right way? Because if you're coming from countries like the Philippines or Mexico, you're waiting, in some type cases, 20, 23 years to get your visa approved. And even when you have your approval, you're waiting to get the actual card, because you have caps. For every country, there's so many visas allotted per year. But when the demand is greater, you have these lines that start to form. And so people can't wait 20 years to be with I couldn't. I go home and see my parents as often as I can, because I don't know what it feels like to be without them. And so you have people who are coming to this country to have a better life, to be with their family, to have better economic opportunities, which ties into a bigger political piece about, the U.S. and our economic relations with countries like Mexico or, China, Canada. But the reason I wanted to say that is just because, look, we had those changes, and then we had in 2006, there was a push to try to do something with immigration reform there, and we didn't get a bill passed. But what did move forward was that we got these huge security measures. We have, drones on the border now. You're seeing way more border security. You have Congress who's allotting, the 34,000 beds for ICE to fill each year. So you have all of these huge enforcement efforts that have been ramped up. And in the bills, every bill that has come through the House, HR 15 has a border component. It's got E-Verify. It's got entry-exit system. The border component and enforcement piece of that bill was passed through bipartisan border committee. It's the McCall bill. McCall's from Texas. He gets it. And so I think it's while it is, back to the political games, that's really what we're just hung up on. You hear time and time again our opponents of immigration reform saying we need to focus on making sure its enforcement is implemented well. Enforcement has been implemented. That's exactly what's tearing our families apart. And so in order to change the way the system works, we need to look at the other pieces of immigration reform. We need to focus on changing those. We need to focus on how do we revamp our visa system so that we don't have these huge lines and we have people coming over in decent amount of times, bringing them into work jobs, both high-skilled and low-skilled jobs, And so that's the bigger piece, and not to be in any way disrespectful of the points that you made, but I really think that's the bigger piece. We can't be holding this enforcement hostage because you're netting zero. You're never going to have a border that's totally impenetrable. We've built walls, and people just want to keep building walls, but that's not the solution. Immigration is about way more than that, and it is about our families and making sure that folks here are taken care of and that we have a workable system to move forward with. So I just want to.
And I do want to open it up to questions from all of you, but Jeff, while you are not an opponent of comprehensive immigration reform, but rather a proponent, in fairness, if there's anything you'd like to add on behalf of those who are advocating for stronger border workplace enforcement, and certainly your prerogative.
There's some good points made. There are additional security measures.
Don't take the bait.
There are additional security measures that have been put along the border. We do have the ability to do, with modern technology, to do a better job of employer screening of immigration status, and we can create some sanctions against employers going forward on creating the attraction of the United States that there's brought so many people here, and rightfully so. I think you do need to have some balance in there, though, for this to be for not only be politically passed, but also to be public policy. I do think it needs to have the basic components that came out of the Senate, and I don't think any of those particular components were draconian.
All right, well, we're going to open it up to your questions now, and as we do at all of our programs, I'm just going to offer 2 reminders before we begin the question period. Number 1, we're going to call on you. If you can, tell us who you are, so we know who's participating in the conversation. And second, particularly on an issue like this one, that engenders just such strong emotions on all sides of the issue, I'd ask that in particular, if you're going to put a question to someone with whom you disagree, that you phrase that question with the same respect and regard that you'd hope they'd show you if they were questioning you and if they disagree with your assertion. You got that, Natalie? That's been a problem in the past, but you're okay with it. Questions for our panel?
How can we trust the Democratic Party or the President to pass immigration reform when by the end of his presidency, he'll be on record to have more deportations than George Bush, and 2, when he had the Congress in his first 2 years to do whatever he wanted, and he passed no immigration reform?
The president's on record, obviously, and obviously, in private, conversations and negotiations, he wants comprehensive immigration reform. There's no question about that. And I'll address the deportations because that's been an issue for a lot of folks in the country, even within the party, too, of angst and deep consternation, especially with the projected numbers that you just articulated. If it continues on that pathway that has separated so many families and created a lot of trauma among intact families that are no longer intact because of these continued deportation, especially because of secure communities that, going back originally when I said in California, we move forward with the Trust Act, we will no longer deal with secure communities. But I have faith that the president wants immigration and comprehensive reform. He's on the record, he's attempted on numerous occasions, he's intended to insert himself into the negotiations. It's been very difficult because, like I said, they had locks come out in so many ways. You get involved, Mr. President, we will walk over from the table. And then it's almost like, what does he do? Does he get involved at the risk of Republicans just stepping away altogether? Or does he perhaps behind the scenes through intermediaries engage behind the scenes to try to get the best immigration package possible, whether it's comprehensive or whether it's like this broken piecemeal version, but the piecemeal version has to be interrelated with each other and not just get this in hope of you negotiate against yourself and you don't get that at the end of the day. What I'm saying is more personal, but I believe and I have faith, that the president does want immigration reform. I know he does.
And so I guess my question is kind of for Jeff, but it's for anybody that wants to chime in. So we saw that with the RNC's release of the Growth and Opportunity Project that the Republican Party is kind of going through this cosmetic makeover, and they want to sort of attract the youth and attract women, and especially attract the Latino Hispanic population. And my question is, to what extent do you think that this is just kind of a facade and a political tactic? Because I know that the Latino vote is very attractive in 2016. And I also would like to know, because I know there's sometimes a lot of frustration when the conversation starts dealing around pathway to citizenship and amnesty. People are like sort of defensive and start saying, well, no, we love Latinos, and like it turns into a topic about Latinos when we're just talking about immigration. And so to what extent do you believe that it's just a political tactic for upcoming elections?
Jeff, the question, if I can paraphrase Tanya, is Republican efforts in this area over the last couple of years, how much of it is substantive and how much of it is political?
I haven't been tracking what the RNC is doing. I really haven't. I think that, there are good people and bad people in every institution. There may be folks that look at this just with a political eyeball on it. I'm not entirely convinced that it's going to pay rewards to Republicans to do this, at least not for another generation, perhaps. But I do think that, and this is what I've been trying to communicate to the Republicans, is that the founding principles of the Republican Party are principles of opportunity, they're principles of entrepreneurialism, they're principles of family, supporting family unification, uniting, and supporting public safety. All of those things are undermined by our current immigration system. All those things would be buttressed by immigration reform. It is entirely consistent with the principles that were embraced by Abraham Lincoln and all the way through Ronald Reagan. I'm not sure exactly whether it could be said of today. But I love my party, but I look at it in a historic context more than anything. And I think if we had come charging out of that gate with Senator Rubio's bill, and he was the champion, and there was momentum building up around him, and if we got into the House and we were able to pass that, and Republicans not only voted for immigration reform, but they were the champion of it, because it was the right thing to do, and they would have, I think, begun the process of change perception of the Republican Party. It's frustrating that we are where we are now, and that is, bogged down. I'm still optimistic, but I think that if we had been able to move that forward and shown that we wanted to make these changes, and we not only get dragged across the finish line, but that we were the champions, the ones that spearheaded it, that formulated it, that brought stakeholders to the table and wrote the bills and passed it, that we would begin the process that I've been trying so hard to do, which is to make the Republican Party more inclusive. So people now, it's been bogged down, and some of the nasty naysayers have begun, more of the vitriolic language has started to percolate back up, because people feel safe again, kind of pointing fingers and being nasty. So they say very negative things about those who support immigration reform, including myself, and they go back to kind of the mantra of, let's not reform the law, let's just enforce the laws that exist, which is not really, that's not a policy suggestion, that's not realistic, that's not even legitimate debate. So I ignore that, and most people do. And it's just going to take more young people get involved that have a different outlook on the world, get involved in the Republican Party and helping shape it from the bottom up. I circulated a letter among my colleagues in the legislature, and I got 15 of them to sign it, calling on, and we did a press conference, and then we took that letter with 15 signatures on it, these were Republicans, calling on Congress to call for the vote now. So 15 of my colleagues signed this letter calling on, really putting pressure on our Republican colleagues in DC to call for the vote. And then we took that letter, and that letter was published in 6 different newspapers and full-page ads up and down the state in key newspapers for key Congress members, House members. And there are more Republicans that support this than oppose it. The trick is for the party to move forward is for those that do, and those that believe in inclusiveness, and those that harken back to the founding principles of the Republican Party, what we can be 20, 30 years from now. Those are the ones that have to take control. They have to take control. And so that's, those are the opportunities I'm looking for, is to take control. So.
Linda, let me ask you a follow-up question here. You and Mayor Garcetti have decided that a less demonstrative and less confrontational approach than the type that Jeff has been approaching, that Jeff was just talking about, have been more effective. And on his trips to Washington and your other outreach efforts, you've decided that an approach of quiet diplomacy is a more effective way of bringing people around. Talk a little bit about that approach, and both the pros and cons of being more quiet and encouraging as opposed to louder and more confrontational.
So, one of the things that we've been actively engaged in, as I mentioned, is a California strategy by, Mayor Garcetti putting together a group of 10 city mayors, large city mayors here in California, And the other strategy, of course, is I think what you're alluding to, Dan, which is sometimes I think behind the scenes conversations could be as useful in some cases as opposed to more perhaps open statements, if you will, around immigration policy. So I think one strategy has been to really think about what that means politically, and also being able to use a more diplomatic approach, perhaps for now at least, to talk to some key people around these particular issues. But I mean, I don't want to say that you know, Mayor Garcetti has also been very active in the community. We had a lot of different activities with some of our nonprofit partners, with faith-based organizations who actually went to Representative McCarthy's office in Bakersfield recently. And so there's a lot of movement, I think, with our nonprofit partners, pro-immigrant rights groups, around being more central in that conversation. But using also this diplomatic strategy, I think, also becomes very helpful and very useful as we move forward with whatever is going to come our way in terms of, you know, federal legislation.
So both a carrot and a stick.
Yes, and we've also been working with the White House with their immigration policy folks as well in various conversations about where the president is. And I think, you know, we're pleasantly surprised that there is a lot of activity and momentum, despite the deportations that was mentioned. I think that from the White House standpoint, that our conversations with them show that there's a lot of great promise. So we're very hopeful and very optimistic.
Kevin, you promised at the beginning of this morning's conversation, that you would make predictions about the possibility for comprehensive immigration reform passing the House of Representatives. So I'll give you a choice now. You can either make a prediction on comprehensive immigration reform or on the NBA championship. It's up to you.
Yeah, I'm still optimistic.
About the Lakers or about
I'm by nature, I'm a very optimistic person. Very optimistic. I'm very idealistic. I still have, even though I've seen a lot, you know, in terms of negotiations on a whole variety of issues, stuff that can make you literally cry when you see how things get done behind the scenes. But I'm still very, very optimistic. Something can get done. The carrot and stick issue, you know, the carrot and stick issue is very, very, very important. If there was no stick, DACA would not have happened. DACA happened because it was young men and women, it was students who pushed the envelope very aggressively. That's how it happened. And it became an administrative executive decision. If it wasn't for the students, it would never have materialized. So credit goes to these young, amazing activists. And it's amazing because you see this new generation. Where I cut my teeth politically was during Proposition 187. And now you see this new crop of young men and women who are really getting involved, politically engaged. I'm wildly optimistic still that something can get done. I'm not quite sure if there'll be a comprehensive immigration reform package. It may end up being something similar to TPS, which is what the Hondurans, the Nicaraguenses, and the Salvadorans have, which is a state of in perpetuity legal residency that's in temporary status.
such as the type that Congressman Gutierrez talked about this week?
I don't know, I didn't hear his comments right there, but I think that if that were to happen, that doesn't say that the game is over. That just says that during this congressional session, this is all we could get at this moment, depending on what happens, you know, because this fluctuates in a very, you know, violent manner up and down in terms of who has the House, who doesn't have the House, on political cycles. We can still get a pathway to citizenship. I know that's debatable. I'm not quite sure if that's within the cards in the immediate next year term. He's already said that, he just said last week, no, Boehner. Now he just changed the other day and said, well, maybe we can perhaps get something. When you roll around to 2014, this is the problem. When you roll into 2014, the pressure will increase within the Tea Party folks, within the GOP, to make sure he really doesn't move it forward because of what's going to happen in their political elections. and you may have even more far-right Tea Party folks than the current Tea Party folks who really drive this harder with internal pressures within that faction, within the GOP. So I think that this piecemeal approach may come to fruition with a pathway to legal residency. Now, ideologically, for a whole variety of reasons, which are understandable with advocates and activists, myself and a ton of other folks, we want citizenship because we believe everyone should have a pathway to citizenship. You don't have a two-tier. That's the desire, and what's real politic, and what may happen is, I think, some version of TPS, which doesn't mean it's game over. Just means it's just the first step, the first inning.
Not only am I going to ask the rest of our panel an equally unfair question about predictions, but because we are almost out of time, what I'll do is I'll ask you to not only answer an unfair question, but to answer it in an unfairly short period of time.
Sorry.
No, Kevin, we were way over long before you started talking, so don't worry. So I guess what I would ask the other panelists, is there anything that you heard from Kevin in terms of prospects for the future with which you would disagree, or any additional points you think would help support his prognostication?
I share the senator's optimistic view. I think that what we're going to see is, if we don't get anything from this Congress in the coming year, we will see opponents and their parties really, really suffering for it at the polls. And I think that that is the message, that as we pivot, just as we're pivoting to 2014, that is the message that our communities, not only are we asking for immigration reform with pathway to citizenship, but we need to have this two-tiered mindset where it's, well, we're asking for this, but if you're not going to give it to us, then this is what's going to happen. And I can just say, from CHIRLA's experience and the work that we're doing, those are even the conversations that I'm having to have with the folks, the members that we work with. Buck McKeon, for example, in the Santa Clarita area, huge changing numbers in terms of demographics. Haven't heard a thing about immigration reform to him, and I think from him, and I think he's waiting for that piece. But I think we're going to get it, and like the senator said, if it turns into something that looks like TPS, it would be really, really unfortunate for our communities. But I think what we have to understand is it's still the long game. We've been waiting decades to have something that is workable and comprehensive. And we thought we got something back in the 80s, and since then it's just kind of turned into a bigger mess. But it's the first foothold, and our movement in the communities never stops. Our work never stops. And so it just turns into, how do we take whatever we get and make it better and the best for our communities in the quickest window possible.
Jeff Gorell.
I think I'd give it 50-50.
Okay.
But
So better than the Lakers, not quite as good as the Clippers.
yeah, exactly. I think the Clippers are definitely going to go all the way.
Okay, thank you.
The chance of it looking like the Republicans championed it, which was my hope, is slim to nil at this point. I still think it has a chance of passing, but it'll look like the Republicans kind of got dragged across the finish line on it, and that ultimately won't help them. It probably hurt them. But that notwithstanding, I still hope it happens, because thoughtful policymakers, move forward on thoughtful policy, and they do so, without having to worry about the political consequences, and so I give it 50-50 at this point. And it really, a lot of it depends on how much focus continues to happen on the ACA, and whether there's enough political will there to reestablish the focus on immigration reform. And I don't know, but I hope it will, and I'll continue to lobby and continue to take out ads and fly to DC and do what I can to push on it, because I think it's important for the people that I represent.
So I actually think that we'll probably see something like administrative relief by the president. I don't think that at this point in the game that there's a lot of time, for instance. Midterm elections are coming. I know, for instance, that the labor community has recently put out a whole campaign with targeted Republican districts, showing the political consequences of not passing reform. We know, for instance, that there's a potential for administrative relief possibly around DACA, and that's something that I think has been conveyed to us in our office, that from the White House, that potentially could be more extensions of DACA. So some kind of additional or administrative relief type of policies could be created by the president. So I think that's one area that we can really think about in terms of possible alternatives. But I think we just have to wait and see, and very optimistic that the president in particular will have that leadership role to, at least at a minimum, provide some kind of administrative relief. I don't know if it's TPS or what format that looks like, but something that I think could show his leadership around this issue.
Well, one thing is clear, on which I will make a prediction, is with this kind of leadership, both in government, the local and the state level, and in the community, the prospects for comprehensive immigration reform are only going to continue to grow. So join me please in thanking Linda Lopez, Gorell, Rita, Medina, and Kevin De León for a fascinating conversation, guys.